Welcome back. I hope that you guys did a good job introducing yourself to each other. You're a really valuable resource as you're studying for tests, forming groups, and all that good stuff. But we're going to move on in the class and give you an overview of what it's about and how we're going to cover the course material. So, that's my name, that's my office. I have office hours twice a week for an hour and a half. You are welcome to drop in anytime during those office hours. You can drop in other times, but I can't guarantee that I'll be available. There's a sign-up sheet on my door, just in case there are lines. Usually office hours are one of the quieter times in my week, and I'm happy to talk to students who come in, but sometimes they get busy, so you can sign up ahead if you're concerned about that. You can email me at that email address, and my office phone number is right there as well. You have 3 TAs. They'll give you their contact and office hour information in recitation. You guys can wave, I guess, as I mention your name. Alicia Hernandez is covering 2 recitations at 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock on Monday. Nick Damp is covering 2 recitations on Wednesday at 2 and Wednesday at 4. And Zan Helmbacher will cover 2 recitations, one on Monday at 5 and one on Wednesday at 3. And recitations definitely meet this week, so go to them. What's the class about? This is a dinosaur. I know virtually nothing about dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs. That's not what archaeology is about. That's what paleontology is about. There are great paleontologists on this campus, and you should seek them out if that's what you want to know. Archaeology is the study of human history. It's a study of human history in a kind of a peculiar way, and we'll talk about momentarily what those peculiarities are. But before I cover that, I want to start by letting you know that I think, and I hope you think, history really matters. You'll notice we're in an election year, and anybody who doesn't think that history matters should listen to the way that all of our politicians from one side of the political spectrum to another are going to be distorting human history, American history in particular, and just making it up as they go along, because they know history matters, and so they figure that no one really knows what happened in history, and so they can say anything they want. History has political meaning, salience. It has salience in shaping our identities and in how we know our place in the world. And it has salience in the nuts and bolts of our lives. And I want to start by giving you a quick example of what I mean by that and how we know that that is so. And to do that, I want to go south of here in Colorado to a place called Ludlow in the year 1914. In 1914, there were a whole series of coal mines along the Front Range, along the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And coal miners, it's a remote part of the world today, no, it's a remote part of the world then. Coal miners lived in basically company towns and worked under terrible conditions, dangerous conditions for long hours and low pay. And they went out on strike in 1914 for higher wages and shorter hours and better working conditions. And as part of the strike, they established a series of camps at the mouths of the canyons that the coal came down through. And so they were hoping to interrupt the flow of coal and put some pressure on the mine owners. And this is a picture of the tent camp at Ludlow. This is a real place where real people lived. On your left, on the lower side, on the lower part of the picture, are some of the miners who lived there, and on the right are the families of a couple of those miners. So they were in this camp with their children and their spouses and trying to live and making a community in that place. And they did interrupt the flow of coal, and the mining companies didn't like this at all. The Rockefeller family was one of the major owners of the coal mines at that time. So they brought in what they referred to as the Colorado Militia, which is sort of a cover for privately hired goons who were uniformed. They could do that, and exceptionally well armed. They had an armored car that they themselves referred to as the Death Special. It was loaded with machine guns. They had used it against miners in other places. And these are photos of the real guys, just as those were photos of the real strikers. These are the real Colorado Militia. And they came in the winter of 1914 when the strike was going on, and there was sort of a standoff for a while until Easter morning. On Easter morning, 1914, somebody started to shoot. There's no clarity at all about exactly how this started, but the militia attacked. Fighting broke out. The militia opened fire with their machine guns. The strikers returned fire with rifles and shotguns. train was actually passing by the camp and saw what was going on and realized they were between the militia and the strikers and stopped and stayed there, much to the anger of the militia, and allowed the strikers, or most of the strikers and their families, to get away. Once the train had moved on, the militia moved in. Most everybody was out of the camp, and they burned the camp to the ground. This is what it looked like afterwards. And on the lower left, your lower left, there is what they left behind from that camp. This was not a secret. There were reporters there, upper right, moving. There's a photo of them coming into the camp with a flag of truce. Please don't shoot us while we go in to write this story. And Ludlow really mattered. That is, people knew what was going on. This is part of the Coal Wars in the early part of the 20th century, when miners were striking in West Virginia and in Colorado and trying to get better working conditions. When people came in to look at what had happened, they found what they called the death pit. Some of these tents had cellars dug beneath them, and in the attack, 2 women and 11 children had gone down into one of these cellars, and when the militia torched the camp, they asphyxiated and died. So they hauled 13 bodies out of this place. Now, the strikers lost at Ludlow. They did. They were forced back with essentially no concessions. But Ludlow and the Coal Wars changed American labor history. That publicity changed American labor history. People were horrified, and Congress began to move to improve working conditions and things like that. Ludlow changed your lives. The conditions that people work under today come out of the things that happened at places like Ludlow. That's real history. And I'm not telling you this because I'm telling you what you should think about unions or about strikes or anything like that. Those are political decisions that you'll make on your own. But when you make those decisions, I think it's really important to know that there is a real human history that came out of that place and those events and the people who you see in front of you on the screen, and that those are that is the history of that leads up to us today and that creates the world that we live in today. And I'm telling you that because Ludlow's a real place. It wasn't just a place in 1914, it's a place today. If you drive south on I-25, you will see an exit marked Ludlow. And the land that this happened on is owned by one of the unions and preserved. And it's a ghost. The town is a ghost town, and the place where the tent camp is a big open field. And it's still there. It's still there. And the death pit is still there. That's what it looked like in 1914 on your left. It's what it looks like today. You can go in when that is open and sit in the place where those people died, and it is the real deal. It is the real place where those people asphyxiated, where those children asphyxiated. And there's a power in that because it's the real deal, and it's the power that archaeology has to make history really matter. Ludlow's an archaeological site. People lived there. That means they generated trash. They built structures there. That means they generated foundations of different kinds, including that cellar. Violence happened there, and there's an archaeology of violence. And in fact, the union that owns that place brought in archaeologists, or cut a deal with archaeologists from the University of Denver and a couple of other places to do an archaeological project on Ludlow and on some of the other strikers' camps. And they excavated houses, and you can see a photo of their excavation in the lower right and a map of that excavation on the photo on the lower left and the map on the lower right. They found stuff. They found firearms, for example, in the upper left. And they found evidence of violence. That top row are bullets. Those are the real deal. Militia members loaded those bullets into their guns and fired them into the camp. And the strikers loaded those cartridges and shotgun casings into their guns, and they fired them back at the militia. A friend of mine talks about the concept of the weight of the evidence having a literal meaning in archaeology. And this is the weight of the evidence. This is what he means when he says that. You can weigh this stuff, and it's got a physical reality that lets us know what happened there. These are children's toys that were recovered intermingled with bullets and shotgun and rifle casings in that camp during those excavations. These are the real deal. Strikers' children really played with those toys, and strikers and militia members really fired those guns that left this archaeology behind. And that's makes concrete, I think, the reality of what happened there. And it does it in a way that only archaeology can do, and that's what this class is about. This is Ludlow today. This is what you'll see if you go there. You won't see casings scattered on the ground and children's toys lying around, but under that ground is the weight of evidence that tells us about the history that happened there, and that matters. It matters regardless of what you think about unions today, because these are their roots. They are in Ludlow and other places where things like this happened. We're going to look at history. It's not always going to be as dramatic as what happened here, but we're going to go back 2.5 million years, and we're going to tell human history using the physical weight of the evidence. And that history matters because it brings us right up to today, whether you're thinking about that in terms of Ludlow or you're thinking that in terms of some other archaeological site. So, how are we going to do that? I said we looked at history, archaeologists look at history in our own peculiar kind of a way, and that's true. That we're going to start by looking at that way. What is it that's peculiar about archaeology? And we'll talk a little bit about archaeological method and theory. We'll talk about archaeological sites, S-I-T-E-S. This is an archaeological site, Gate Cliff Shelter in central Nevada. We'll see a film about Gate Cliff, and we'll look at how sites are found and how sites are investigated once we know where they are. Why are archaeological units always square? Why do we like dirt? How do we look at time? Once we've got some stuff, how do we know how old it is? If what you're looking at here has old stuff on the bottom and young stuff on the top, and that is one of the fundamental laws of archaeology. And we'll look at stratigraphy a little bit. We'll look at finer ways of controlling time. This is an example of those. We can date trees to a single year, and we can sometimes date archaeological sites using trees that we can date to a single year. So we'll talk about dendrochronology, and we'll talk about radiocarbon dating, and we'll talk about some other techniques. Archaeology is very much the study of material culture in time and space. That is the definition of archaeology. You'll hear that from me again. The material culture that we study, the physical remains of human activities, whether they're bullets at Ludlow or stone artifacts that people made over the last 2.5 million years, are often really alien from us. And so we have to learn to understand those artifacts. We need to be able to look at them as information. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Periodically, you'll hear about different kinds of material culture. One big one that we'll talk about is flint knapping, flaked stone artifacts, and how they're made and what they can tell us. We'll hide a lot of method and theory in the next 4 topics that we'll talk about, or 5 topics, excuse me. And so we'll start when archaeological history picks up. And that's a particular kind of history. It's a history about material culture. So we're not going to look at the whole of human evolutionary history. We're going to pick up at the moment when we start to get archaeology, when human garbage, in effect, starts becoming visible in the world, which is ballpark 2.5 million years ago. And the first big topic we're going to look at is the archaeology of becoming human. This is a 2.5 million year old ancestral human skull from a species known as Homo habilis. This skull shows up at about the time that garbage shows up. This summer, people discover that there's in fact another kind of hominin skull that shows up at about the same time. So we'll talk a little bit about that diversity, but we're really going to focus on what material culture tells us about these creatures. We can see a little bit about their potential by looking at their bones, but we can see what they actually did by looking at their archaeology, and this is what the earliest archaeology looks like. Broken stones and broken cut smooth bones. It's exactly this prosaic, it's exactly this simple and enigmatic, and we'll look in some detail at what these stones and bones can tell us about what these creatures actually did, how they actually live their life, and we'll talk about some of the controversies about that and how archaeology helps to tease those controversies out. We'll move on. We run fast through human history in this class sometimes. About a little bit after 2 million years ago, we get a new hominin species called Homo erectus. This is an image of the most complete of those, a young boy from a site called Nariokotome in Kenya. He is almost the same as us from the neck down, not quite the same, and we'll talk about that, but he is a whole lot not like us from the neck up. At about the same time that Homo erectus shows up, we get a major change in stone technology. You see that on the right. Hand axes or bifacial technology, and we will look at that and at the connection between the changes in him and his descendants and the changes in technology as well. Homo erectus peopled most of the Old World, not Australia, but much of the rest of the Old World. And out of that peopling come changes in many parts of the world. Eventually, out of them come Neanderthals, and they are the particular kind of Homo erectus descendant that we see in Europe. They're also the Homo erectus descendant, one of the two Homo erectus descendants that we know the most about. And we'll look at Neanderthals like this one from La Chapelle. Hope that your teeth never end up like that guy's teeth did. We'll talk about what that might have meant for his life and for the lives of his friends and family. And Neanderthals really aren't us. We're on you're right there, and Neanderthals are on the left. They could have walked down the street, and you would have known that they were walking down the street. They would have looked at them. They would have looked kind of human, but not completely. And we'll talk about that difference. And we'll talk about how we see the implications of that difference at sites like Chauvet Cave. Our ancestors, direct ancestors, appear to have arisen in Africa, not in Europe, not in Asia, and they seem to have peopled the world just as Homo erectus did. And their mark, one of the major marks they left on the world in Europe and in other places, is art. It's one of the major things that distinguishes them from earlier hominins. And we'll look at Chauvet and other sites and other distinctions between modern humans and our more ancient ancestors. Once we have modern humans in the world, we'll shift from sort of how archaeology tells us about the change in our evolutionary lineage to how we see variation in the ways that modern humans have lived. And we'll move on to the second topic. How do we people the rest of the world? How do we people Australia and especially North America and South America? And how the end of the Ice Age changed our ways of life, our ancestors' ways of life. Those two things happen very much at the same time. So we'll look at the archaeology of peopling, Australia and North America and South America, and we'll look particularly at the controversies in the New World and talk about what those do and don't tell us about where Indian people came from. And we'll look at the way that the Ice Age changed the conditions that our ancestors lived under and how we see the appearance of really fully settled communities in the Near East. And we're going to spend a lot of time in here, in the Near East. So we're not going to be looking at settled farmers at this moment, but the community that this is a depiction of were settled hunters and gatherers living on wild resources. And we'll talk about what their way of life was like, how they made a living, how they've hunted and gathered, and then how that pattern eventually changed into something very different. So once we look at that end of the Ice Age and peopling the world, we move on into the domestication of plants and animals. In part, we will start, when we look at that, by looking at these little flake stone tools and the role that they played, because they turn out to be essential in the transition from those settled hunters and gatherers to settled farmers. They were the sharp edges and sickles that those settled hunter-gatherers used. We call those settled hunter-gatherers Natufians. So Natufian sickles played a major role in the domestication, especially of plants. And once we see domestication happening, we see the appearance of real settled farmers. And when those people settle down, they settle down into big sites that stay in place for a really long time. That mound that you're looking at right there is the site of Abu Huraira. And Abu Huraira was in place for thousands of years, and thousands of people lived in that place as farmers. The base of Abu Huraira is that hunter-gatherer community that I showed you that artistic depiction of. And after abandonment for a little bit of time, that hunter-gatherer community became a long-term, long-term permanent farming community. And we'll talk about that transition and what are the similarities and what are the differences in the lives that people who lived in the base of that site, how they lived and how they were different and the same in some important ways as the people who lived in the top of that site. Farming appeared independently in a handful of places in the world. It appeared in the Near East, and we know more about that process than we do about anywhere else, but it appeared in China, and it appeared in Mexico, and it appeared in Peru, and it probably appeared in New Guinea. But once it appeared in those places sort of independently, it also appears in among their neighbors. And it appears both by the spreading of agricultural populations and by the transformation of pre-existing hunter-gatherer populations. Remember what I said, Homo erectus peopled the world, they were all hunters and gatherers, and then our biological ancestors, our direct biological ancestors, anatomically modern people, peopled the globe. And they were hunters and gatherers when they did that. So there are people everywhere. And now they're not hunters and gatherers everywhere, there are farmers almost everywhere. And so those folks have changed, farmers have both moved into hunter-gatherer territory and they have transformed hunter-gatherer lives. And we're going to look a little bit at that process in Europe. And we'll look at the movement of farmers up the Danube River into Central Europe. We'll call them linear band ceramic or LBK sites. This is the footprint of the houses they lived in. And we'll look at their spread all the way as far west and north as you can get in Europe out to Ireland, and we'll spend a little time looking at the Irish Neolithic. Once we've looked at Europe, so we've looked at the development of agriculture and we've looked at its spread, we'll go back into the Near East and we'll look at the fourth major topic that we talk about, which is the rise of the state, the rise of differentiated complex societies who built structures like this, which is the ziggurat of Ur, the city of Ur, one of the great urban centers of the ancient world in what we now call Iraq, but what in the past we called Mesopotamia. We see differentiation in the most concrete ways possible. We see differentiation in houses and in food, and we see it in death ritual. And in the city of Ur, we see one of the most spectacular death rituals archaeologists have ever encountered. You're looking at the burial of a young woman. At the base of that picture is a necklace that she was wearing, two necklaces that she was wearing. She's got a headdress made out of solid gold. The necklace is made out of gold and lapis and other precious stones. She was dressed when she died, and she died in the place that she was found. She was dressed like this. She was the attendant to a queen. She went to her death when the queen she attended went to her grave. That kind of death ritual is characteristic of these early states, and we'll talk about that. We will also talk about the true urban society that she lived in, and that thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of people lived in with her. A huge transformation of human settlement into real cities, and we'll talk about how those cities were organized. Ur was right at the southern extent of Mesopotamia at the time. It's dry land now. It was a coastal port. When people lived there, Mesopotamia or Iraq has accumulated a lot of sediment, and the dry land part of Iraq has moved far south, leaving Ur stranded in the middle of the desert. But it was a major trading center, and it was connected from western Turkey into Sinai and all across into Afghanistan, into India. We can see that in the way objects moved into Ur. They knew their neighbors, they interacted with their neighbors, and we're going to look at one of their neighbors, also a stratified urban society, but one that was quite different from the ones we see in Mesopotamia. That's the Indus Valley cities of eastern Pakistan and western India. So we'll spend a couple of days there. Once we've looked at Ur and the Indus, at Mesopotamia and the Indus, we will move over to the New World, and we'll spend a few lectures in North America. We'll look at complexity in North America at sites like Cahokia, which is otherwise known as East St. Louis, Illinois, and talk about the kinds of societies that led up to the great center of Cahokia, what Cahokia itself was like, and then we'll look at some of the people who were connected with these complex Eastern North American societies out on my turf. I work on the Great Plains, so I'm going to force you to learn a little bit about plains archaeology. We'll talk about bison, and we'll talk about village farmers on the Great Plains, both of whom, bison hunters and village farmers, who knew people in the East and who talked to them and whose lives changed because they knew those Eastern people. Once we've looked a little bit at North American archaeology, and we will barely scratch the surface of what we see in the United States and Canada, we will move down into Mexico, and we'll spend more time comparing the great city of Teotihuacan and the Maya of the area in southern Mexico and Guatemala and Belize. We'll do some movies and lectures on Teotihuacan. We'll talk about what is in this huge pyramid at Teotihuacan, and we'll look at the organization of these cities just the way that we looked at organization of cities in Mesopotamia and in the Indus. And we'll see that there are huge similarities in all of these urban stratified societies. There's important differences, and we have to understand those, but there's a remarkable set of continuities or comparative similarities that humans seem to come up with whenever we settle down into cities and build these stratified societies. The last topic that we'll cover is what you can call text-dated archaeology. In a sense, you can think of it being the archaeology of us. There is an archaeology of 20th century North America. There's an archaeology of 20th century United States. Some of it's very unpleasant. It involves modern garbage dumps and things like that, which tell us things about our lives that we don't always want to know. But we won't be doing that in here. What we'll do is focus a little bit more on sometimes dramatic events. Certainly the Custer fight is one of the more dramatic events in the history of Western America. And we'll talk about how archaeology changes our view of that fight, and what happened in that ground. Archaeology, for one thing, tells us how at least one of Custer's troopers died. That's what this picture should indicate to you pretty clearly. But we'll talk about the rest of that battle and its implications for our understanding of Western expansion and how archaeology drives those implications. And we'll also look in a film at a little bit more prosaic kind of archaeology, the archaeology of coal mining in California, and the archaeology of slaves in coastal Georgia, and the archaeology of the development of the city of Boston that's underneath the city of Boston today. Once we're finished with all of that, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about archaeology in the modern world and why it matters. You know, if Ludlow matters, if Homo erectus matters, if the Custer fight matters, what does that have? What does that tell us about an archaeological record that's in the ground now and is fragile and irreplaceable? And we'll discuss how archaeology gets done in the United States today in that context. So that's where we're going. To get there, you're going to be here in front of me, usually a live version of me, not usually a digital version, 3 times each week. You'll be in recitation 1 time per week, and you'll be reading your book. We have 1 required text. It's by Kenneth Fader. It's called The Past in Perspective. Please get the 5th edition. If you get an earlier edition, the pages won't match up and the information in the book will be a little bit different. So be sure you get the 5th edition. You can buy it at the bookstore. You can rent it, I think, at the bookstore. I know that you can rent it on some of the online textbook rental places. So if you don't want to keep it forever, or you don't want to buy it and give it and sell it back, look for it as a rental. You'll be graded in a variety of ways. The biggest chunk of your grade is going to come from 3 exams. These are all going to be structured in the same way. They're going to mix objective, which is to say multiple choice, short answer, and essay. You will have a choice of short answers and a choice of essays to answer, and then a set of multiple choice that you have to answer. The first 2 of these exams are worth 100 points each, and they are not cumulative. The first midterm covers the first third of the class, and the second midterm covers the second third of the class. The final exam is cumulative, but it's a cumulative exam in a particular way. 100 points of the final will cover the last third of the class, and the other 25 will be questions that we actually cut and paste from the first 2 exams and put onto the final. So you'll have 100 points on new material and 25 points that are right off the first 2 exams. So you should do well on those 25 points. Your grades will also include points from recitation, and points in recitation take 2 forms. One of them is that you're going to do a series of internet-based projects that your TAs will tell you more about in recitation that will lead to 5 short essays, each one of which is worth 10 points. Those are going to be to chase particular archaeological questions on the internet, see what you find out, and then think and talk with the recitation about whether what you find out is really plausible or not. I think there's a good archaeological lesson in trying to find information on the internet. There's probably a good life lesson to remind us all that there are no standards for what goes up on the internet, and you can say anything you want, and people do. So they're going to kind of focus, these projects kind of focus on that in the context of archaeology. You also get recitation points for attendance and participation. You'll get 2 points for showing up and 3 points for participation each week. 5 points total potential, total of 75 points. It's good to be in recitation. It gives you a chance to do some hands-on projects. It gives you a chance to participate in discussions. It gives you a chance to get to know each other a little better, and it will be the place where we do exam reviews. So you should be there. If you get to the end of the class or the middle of the class and you decide you aren't happy with your grade, you have the opportunity to get 20 points of extra credit. We will tell you about archaeological lectures that are in the Denver-Boulder area. and you can get credit for attending them and writing an essay. You can't just show up. You have to actually write something. There's guidelines for these essays on the syllabus. Television shows, sometimes there are specials that bear directly on this class, and you may find some of these on your own on the Discovery Channel and the History Channel. If we announce them in class, they're definitely eligible for extra credit. If you hear about one that we haven't announced in class, please check it with me or your TAs to see if we think it's eligible, and you can write an essay on those as well. If you can't find anything that's interesting, or sometimes we run out of lectures by late in the semester and you want one more essay, you can write an essay on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. If you do that, you have to follow the guidelines that are in the syllabus, though, and it's worth 10 points just as all the other essays are. Okay, that's about it. We should have room in this class. If you're on a wait list, you should know that there's usually about 10% turnover, but that the wait list runs by recitation, not by lecture. So if you're in a full recitation and you're on the wait list for that, if you're second on that, you're going to need 2 people to drop out of that recitation before you roll in. And there are open recitations, as far as I know, particularly the Monday at 5 recitation is open, so there should be spaces in the class, and if you want to be in it, your chances of getting in are 100% if you switch recitations. I think your chances, if you're high on the wait list for a particular recitation, are pretty good, but I can't promise. And we'll keep an eye on that, and you should keep an eye on that as well. So thanks for being here. Ask questions of your TAs once this is done. I think there's going to be one more of these digital lectures on Wednesday, and I will be back live on Friday. So thanks for enrolling in the class, and I look forward to meeting you all.